two-color paintings to begin with, which I love. I love two-color painting. They're called tonal paintings, and they're really fun to do, I think. Today we're going to add more to it and go from there and really get into our watercolor and making mixes. Today, have a lot of scrap paper around you. We're going to mix some colors. We're going to talk about colors and how they work. Some of you have painted a while, know this, I'm sure. But it's a beginning class, and we're starting at the beginning, so everybody will have a good place to begin from. And there's our primaries. They're circled, the red, the yellow, and the blue, which probably most people know. These are very arbitrary, by the way. You can have so many different ways of picking three colors to work with, three primaries even. And generally they're called primaries because with these three colors, theoretically, you can mix any other color that you might need. In reality, that's totally not true at all. You can't do that. You can get closer if you use this primary version. Magenta, cyan, or yellow, a good strong medium yellow like Hansa yellow medium. And the blues, the cyan, cerulean blue or phthalo blue, the green shade are very close to cyan, and they work just fine for that. And magenta, which is sort of a reddish violet, but believe it or not, magenta is not on the light spectrum, and it's not actually considered a color because of that. It's kind of a weird thing because, you know, you can mix red and blue wavelengths and everything, but naturally occurring magenta is not a real thing. But nonetheless, it makes really nice mixes. You can mix good strong reds all the way to orange with the yellow, and purples with the blue, very nice. And with the cyan, you can mix a range of really strong greens. But even using these that really work, you don't want to spend your life trying to come up with exact mixes of a certain shade of color or tone or whatever. And so we do a different thing in watercolor. By the way, here's some things you can buy. Actually, this is the front and the back of a color wheel. These will give you all kinds of information on color, on color combinations. There's a lot of different combinations you can paint with if you want to use a particular one, like analogous colors or split complementaries. And we're not even going to bother with that right now. Just let me say that all they are is a way to provide unity in your picture by colors that work well together. But this will tell you complements and all kinds of useful things that sooner or later you'll know all of this just intuitively after you've worked with color a while anyway. I've got one I found just to copy it here, and I never use it. Complementary colors, though. This is one of the more important things you're ever going to know is what are complementary colors. They're opposite each other on the color wheel, and they are so useful in so many ways. They do complement each other. When you put an orange next to a blue, both of the colors really pop out, and that's a useful thing to know. You can really use that to direct a person's eye in your pictures. Also, when you mix those complements, you get neutrals. Sometimes you get some very useful grays, other times you get very useful browns, with a lot of color complexity in them, which is usually kind of nice. So you can manipulate just exactly the shade of gray you want to enhance the rest of your picture for whatever you're trying to do with it. And I'll show some examples of that here in a minute. One thing you don't want to do is have a painting where you have equal amounts of a complement, where they're sort of fighting each other. Then your eye really doesn't know where to rest. So make sure if you're using complements in a large way in a painting to let one dominate the other. It really doesn't matter which, but just don't let them fight it out on an equal basis, because it will be confusing. Here are some examples of some complements in a sketch. This is one at Oxford I did. See, I used yellow and purple. And that makes a nice complement, especially when you got a yellow sky. I like to do that a lot with silhouettes. Another thing you'll notice in this painting, my little pointer here, you can see that little bit of red right there? That really brings out the greens. Just that little touch of red makes a lot of difference. If you put your finger over that picture without the red, it looks a lot different. So a little bit of use of a complement here and there can really spark some more interest in your painting. Here's a red and green. This one where the green dominates, almost not, because that red wheelbarrow there is a pretty large red object, but it's a complementary painting. I painted this to illustrate a poem by Wallace Stevens. No, it's Carlos Williams, William Carlos Williams, the red wheelbarrow. Yeah, that's a red-green complement there. Also, we have color temperature to talk about. And it's kind of a strange thing to think colors have temperatures, but they do. I guess we associate it in our minds with fire and heat, things like that. So we have our warm colors, and they seem to advance in a painting. They come to the foreground right up in your face. A lot of times where the darker colors, the cooler colors, from red violet, say, to green, these are cool colors and tend to recede. Maybe in our minds, we look in the distance, and because of aerial perspective and atmospheric dust and things like that, colors tend to gray and blue as they get farther and farther away and desaturate. If you're looking across a village and they have red roofs, you want to make sure you paint your red roofs in the foreground a lot more colorful and saturated than ones in the back where you want to gray them down, and it'll increase the effective distance in your painting. So this warm and cool concept is useful. And here's a couple of examples I did just the other day. Remember the old teapot and plate and cup? Notice this cup here. You'll see warm gray undertones in that whole cup there. I did that because it was in forward, in the first position in this painting. You might call it the foreground. And so I wanted to bring it forward and make sure it was reading as being in forward. Now, if you move back and look at the plate, it's mostly blue shades of gray and touches of blue in the shadows to make it recede farther back. So I increased a bit of depth in what was essentially an all white picture. The teapot, I've tried to make sort of an intermediate gray in between these two, since it was between the two objects. And so that was the reason behind the colors that I chose, even though I was limiting these to two colors, burnt sienna and ultramarine. Notice the really deep blues and almost purplish tinge I got back in here on the very background. And that's why I chose those colors. It wasn't random or an accident. The same with this cup. I used the burnt sienna to bring the cup forward, used the bluer colors in the background to set it back. And so that's one way you can really use warm and cool colors to make things advance and recede the way you might want them to. Mixing basics are really simple. All colors lean one way or another. If you look at your colors and paint them out on your paper there, you're going to have like an ultramarine blue. They tend to be a little reddish. And other blues like a cerulean or a phthalo blue green shade are going to have that green tinge to them. Sometimes it's not terribly noticeable, but it really becomes noticeable when you mix other colors with it. Suppose you had this red here that leans blue. That would be an alizarin crimson is a great example of that. Probably the most common. It leans quite a bit blue. So if you mixed it with an ultramarine that's leaning back toward that red direction, they're going to make a really nice bright purple. If that's what you want, that's great. But suppose you wanted a subdued purple that wasn't so deeply saturated, then you'd want to use a red that leaned toward the yellow, like cadmium red, or I use pyrrole scarlet a lot. Same as cadmium red, you can hardly tell the difference in those two colors. But that will mute the purple, and you'll get a duller color by using we're going to call these also, you know, they're leaning this way, and to me that makes more sense, but also the one that leans toward the blue, since it's leaning the blue direction, is called a cool red. The one leaning towards the yellow down there is called a warm red. So you'll hear it used both ways. In fact, if you're reading a lot of the older books, they'll use warm and cool. But some of the newer books are using more, talking about which direction the color leans. With yellows, you know, it's a little harder. Some are very definitely leaning to the red, like New Gamboge is a good example. Some are very orangish. Quinacridone Gold that I use a lot has a lot of orange overtones to it. And some will lean green, like a lemon yellow. So if you mix a lemon yellow and a cerulean blue, you're going to get a very bright green. You even get a brighter green if you'll use a phthalo blue. That's how these colors work, and that's one reason in a beginning palette you're going to want two each of your primaries. One that leans one direction and one that leans the other, a cool and a warm of each color. It makes mixing a whole lot quicker and easier. Another thing is to generally avoid mixing more than two colors together, because when you do, you know, like we said, they've all got bits of overtone. So if you're mixing a red that leans blue, say with a blue that leans red, that's fine. You've got reds and blues in your mix. But suppose now you want to throw in a touch of yellow, or a touch of green, say, into that. It's going to have blue, which is fine in it, but it's also going to have a bit of yellow in it. And because of that, when you get all three primaries, red, yellow, and blue, you start making neutrals. So that color can quickly turn to brown or gray. And essentially what you make, a lot of people just call mud, because that's kind of what it looks like a lot of times when you start mixing more than two colors. Not always, if you're very careful. And for flesh tones, I mix three colors a lot of times, but only adding a minute amount of the third color. So very definitely kind of try and keep it down to two. It's also easier to keep track of. If you've not made enough and you need to remix it, it's a lot easier to match your two-color mix than it would be to match a three-color mix. And that does happen occasionally. So choosing and comparing colors. All of them usually now have listed on the tube the paint light fastness ratings. A lot of times the pigment information. This is from Daniel Smith here, and they'll list their staining levels, granulation, and transparency. Some paints are very transparent, and others are very opaque. The most opaque color is Indian red, and then maybe yellow ochre after that. Those are two very opaque paints. Staining paints, the most staining paints I know are the phthalos. Phthalo green and phthalo blue will stain everything, including china. So watch out using that stuff. They're very powerful paints. Most paints anymore are pretty good on the light fast rating. 1 or 2 is usually, they're mostly rated that way these days. Didn't used to always be that way. There were a lot of fugitive colors, colors that would fade very quickly in the sun. Generally, the more white in them and the less pigment, the more likely they're going to be to fade. And that's the same with colored pencils too. The very light colored pencils, like a lavender or something like that, is more likely to fade than a deeply pigmented colored pencil will. So, and that's just really a matter of how much pigment is in there compared to binder and everything. So here we have, oh, by the way, I got this cobalt blue here. It's the closest thing to a neutral color in watercolor. At least that's what most people say. It's almost a true blue. Other paints are not. Here's our ultramarine. You can see it's a lean and a little red in there. Once you get used to these, you can start seeing that. It's kind of a little bit purpley. And that's why it's not a pure blue. So choosing your palettes for blues. You want a warm and cool of each of these, and it really, you know, you can use the cobalt blue as a warm. It's okay. I like something even warmer. I like ultramarine, and that's just such a standard color. You'll find so many mixes made with it. It's really useful. It granulates and looks real nice on your paper. And I'd probably recommend that one for one warm blue. For a cool blue, you've got all kinds of things to choose from. I use cerulean blue chromium. That's the original. There's also a cerulean blue hue, but it doesn't seem quite the same. Maybe I'm just, you know, used to the old one, and so I like it better. Other cool blues, Prussian blue, phthalo blue. Phthalo is a great cool blue. It's just so powerful and staining that you got to be careful with it. I've got a tube of that blue, a small one. I think it's a 5 mil tube that's lasted me 15 years. Just a touch of that paint and it just explodes, I tell you, at least for me. Prussian blue is really an interesting color. It's an older color, mixes some great greens and with yellows, but also with some of the browns, makes some really good greens with Prussian blue. I like Prussian blue doing triads sometimes, combining it with a burnt umber and maybe then some kind of a yellow. So be interesting in that respect. Reds, cadmium red is, you know, used to be the standard. Everybody just used the cadmium red light or cadmium red medium, but the cadmium colors are kind of going away and they're being replaced with cadmium hues. Cadmium is toxic, and so trying to keep it out of watercolor these days. Pyrrole scarlet, very similar as you can see. I use that. I've also got organic vermilion, and I can't tell the difference between the two. If there is, it is so slight as to be just almost non-existent. Apparently the Pyrrole scarlet stains a little more. See, it's a number 3, where the organic vermilion is a number 2. So other than that, there's just next to no difference in them. Cool reds are a lot more available than they used to be. Alizarin crimson, some of the red matters are cool. What else do we have? There's several cool reds. Quinacridone rose is a very useful one. You can make beautiful purples for flowers and things with quinacridone rose. Excellent for any botanical sort of illustrations. I use the permanent alizarin crimson. If you had to pick one color of red to ever use in your palette, that would be the one to choose. Because it's warm enough that you can mix a purple, you can mix a orange with it. You can do a lot with alizarin crimson there. It's a very useful color. I probably use it more than anything for a lot of things. All I find, I really don't use red a lot unless I'm mixing flesh tone. Yellow, again, lots of yellow choices. Cadmium yellows used to be, again, the standard. Cadmium yellow light would give you kind of a greenish tinged lemony color, whereas the cadmium darks would be toward the orangish edge of things. Now you can get lemon yellow hue, very transparent. That's a nice color to use for a lemon. Works well for a yellow green. New gamboge, again, it's transparent now too. The old gamboge used to fade, but this one's permanent. And it's a very orangish yellow. I use quinacridone rose, quinacridone gold, which is more of an earth color really, but at very thin tints, it's just more or less a pure yellow with an orange tinge to it that's really useful for so many things. I just could hardly paint without it. It's my main yellow. Greens, you could mix all your greens if you wanted to, but it's if you're in a hurry, especially if you're out like me, out painting outdoors, you don't want to mess around mixing more colors than necessary. And I'll tell you how I mix my greens. I start with basic greens and go from there. But warm ones, sap green used to fade a lot, but the new sap greens don't. They do really well. That's a Daniel Smith there, and I really like that sap green a lot. Hooker's green works better in northern climates. It just helps match those tree colors up there better. Arkansas, we have yellow greens. Even our pines have a yellow tinge to them. So you might as well start with something like that to begin with. If you painted a pine with phthalo green, it would not look like a pine tree. These are very blue shades, as you can see. I use Viridian rather than phthalo green, and the reason is Viridian is weaker, and I'm using it in mixes anyway, and I don't have to worry about it staining to any extent at all. You can lift it out. I just think it's a more useful color. It's an older color than the phthalos, but I prefer it quite a bit. And it does granulate, as you can see here, compared to the phthalo, which is more of a dye, so it doesn't granulate to that extent.
Is that a good?
Yes. Question?
Is it a good or bad thing for it to granulate?
It depends on what you want. It's not a good or a bad thing. Some people like the granulations. It's just kind of interesting to see the little particles fall out. Adds more complexity maybe to the painting, and they mix a little differently. A dye can be very smooth, and sometimes when you have a large area, very smooth, monotonous color, it's boring. So the granulations actually, I think, make painting more interesting. But it's certainly not necessary, and I don't always choose a color because it granulates or doesn't. Purples are so easy to mix that if I don't have room in the palette, I don't take a purple with me. But at the same time, it's so convenient. This Cobalt Violet on its own is a terrible color. It's kind of weak, and every tube I've ever bought's been gummy, and I've actually opened up tubes and stirred them all up to kind of get them back to some semblance of usefulness. I think actually buying a pan of Cobalt Violet might be better than the tube. But it's so convenient in the skies. A light wash of that underneath clouds is just almost the exact color of shadows in Arkansas in a lot of our skies, especially in the morning. Nice puffy cumulus cloud, and you can put that right over the blue, right underneath the cloud, and it'll look just almost exactly the color of cloud shadows here in Arkansas a lot of the time. Imperial purple or dioxazine purple, they're all pretty much the same, a real dark purple. These are great for mixing with dark greens. You can make some intense blacks with this. Purline green and imperial purple or dioxazine purple makes a real interesting black and dark for backgrounds and things. You've seen some of my paintings. I do that quite a bit with those colors. It's very intense. Doesn't take much of it. Earth tones. I use these a lot, and they're so variable. These are one of the more variable colors you're going to get between brands, manufacturers. These colors you're all seeing today are Daniel Smith. I use some Winsor Newton colors for certain things, but those are the two companies, and Da Vinci. I use Da Vinci for some colors. But in general, I stick mostly with Daniel Smith. They're easy to get, and they're good paints. Sometimes I find they're not as have as complex overtones as, say, some of Winsor Newton's does, so I prefer that. But burnt sienna here, this is the Daniel Smith one. I use Da Vinci because when I mix Da Vinci burnt sienna with ultramarine blue, I get a really nice neutral gray. If I use Daniel Smith burnt sienna, it's got just enough red in it that I usually end up with some sort of a gray purple, which is fine, but it's not what I wanted. And so I go to the trouble of getting the Da Vinci for that because, you know, it's the color I want. I actually take a full pan and I mix half of that pan, I'll squirt in ultramarine blue, and the other half I'll squirt in burnt sienna, and I'll stir them together with a toothpick. And that makes a gray that I can go to very readily, and I can add a little more burnt sienna to it on the paper, and I've got a warm gray. And I can add a little bit of ultramarine blue to it, and I can mix up a cool gray really quickly. So I kind of make my own paint on that. Burnt umber, this is a Winsor Newton color that I use too. The Winsor Newton color has some yellow undertones to it that are really nice. Raw umber is really interesting. This is Daniel Smith raw umber, and it's a really good cool brown. It's very useful. It's almost like a sepia. Whereas if you got the Winsor Newton or other browns, they almost look like yellow ochre. They're very yellow and much lighter. I'm not sure why They make them so differently, but definitely I use the Daniel Smith raw umber because I need that cool brown, and there's very few other cool browns you can buy. Quinacridone burnt orange is almost a substitute for burnt sienna. They make a quinacridone burnt sienna, but it's more orange than this. For some reason, it's a badly named paint. But if you want to match burnt sienna with something that, see, it's transparent here, then very definitely the burnt orange is the way to go. And also, this works really well in shadows to brighten them up and to use as shadows from reflected light and things. So I keep some in my palette and use it more and more these days. Yellow ochre is good for neutralizing any color just about. You can put a touch of yellow ochre in something and it will, you know, really sort of desaturate that color and tone it down. Used to in old books, they would suggest you desaturate almost every color that you used. If you do every single color, then pretty soon you got a pretty blah painting. But it does neutralize and make colors look a little more realistic to add a touch of that into some of them, especially some of those bright greens that don't really look real to begin with. Here is just a chart showing you all the different colors you might get. Da Vinci, I was searching for a burnt sienna that matched Da Vinci, and I couldn't find one. That's Da Vinci, that's what I use. Here's Daniel Smith, see, it's a little redder. Here's Daniel Smith burnt sienna, it's even more red. There's the burnt orange. Here's Daniel Smith English red ochre. That's a nice color, but even more useful is this Winsor Newton light red. It has more red than the burnt sienna and really works well in foliage for a lot of things. I just, anymore, I wouldn't paint without reds, the light red. You can also put a lot in landscapes like that. Umber, here's what I was talking about. Here's Daniel Smith raw umber. Here is Winsor Newton raw umber. Look how much more yellow it is, just amazing. What it is a whole lot like is the Daniel Smith goethite. So they give them these different names, and you just, don't know what you're getting half the time. For that reason, what you want to do is get a color sheet, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Grays and blacks you don't need. Payne's gray is so useful, though. I really like Payne's gray. This is Daniel Smith Payne's gray, and it looks more like neutral tint. They have come out with a Payne's blue gray that is actually looks like a Payne's gray. Winsor Newton Payne's gray looks just like this one, and both are really good colors. Where I use them most frequently, a lot of times, is in skies and clouds, and also to paint windows that are dark. That's just perfect color to paint dark windows. So I use that. These blacks, lunar black is interesting in that it's got metal filings in it to make it granulate. And I've done neat things where you can paint some of that, and while it's still wet, put a really strong magnet underneath it, and you can move those filings around and make patterns and stuff with them. It's kind of interesting thing. Otherwise, you really rarely use a black. They kind of deaden pictures a lot of times. But when you need a black, what do you get? Well, the ivory black is much warmer, maybe not as dense and opaque as the lamp black. Lamp black is pure carbon, like it pretty much is scraped off a lamp, you might say. So it's very black. This is much warmer, generally more useful, but really none of these. Neutral tint you can put into about any color and darken it down, but I don't know, I never do. Whites are another thing that really confuse people, and they come in almost every paint set you're ever going to buy, it seems like. It'll have Chinese white in it, and about all you can do with Chinese white is mix pastel colors. It's really good for that. You can put on some soft highlights, but it just sort of absorbs into it. I would never just buy Chinese white watercolor. If I wanted Chinese white, I would buy gouache. The gouache is probably the same thing exactly, maybe a different binder, but it's usually less expensive and every bit as good. If you want covering power, go with titanium white. You can buy it in a watercolor, but again, I buy the gouache. Titanium white's really good for covering things up. I'll show you a picture. I used quite a bit of it on today. You can mix it with other watercolors too. I do that a lot of times too. I use titanium white gouache for corrections a lot. It's just really, really useful for that. And I consider that a part of my palette. Although, don't put it in your palette. Keep it in a separate tube. You can even put your little paintbrush down the tube hole with a damp brush and pick up your paint that way. If you start getting that titanium white mixed with your other colors on the palette, you're going to have a real mess. So don't do that. It looks like we're running out of time. We may have to go into this a little more. These are useful colors. I'm going to send you this entire slideshow as a PDF file you can open on your computer. So I think that will help you. You can kind of spend some time looking at it. These are colors I use right now. Many we've already talked about, and I'll talk about some more. This is the rest of them. They're just on here, and you can look at them. Again, choose your colors for where you're working. If you're here in Arkansas, you're going to want a lot of yellow greens and things if you're working outside. In Scotland, I go to visit my son a lot. Everything's gray, so I usually bring a lot of colors that I can mix gray with. So just kind of think about where you're going, and what you're painting will sometimes determine what's on your palette. Oh, I had so much to say here. Try mixing your paints on your paper rather than in your palette. That works very well a lot of times. Always add a lighter color, add a darker color to a light one, or you may end up using all the light color you've got trying to get rid of the dark. Generally, yellow is the only one you really have to worry about on that. Some of the others too. Another thing, don't overmix your paints. Sometimes if you'll put them in your palette and you're stirring it like an egg beater and everything, it just seems to do something to the colors. You might just want to give it a little bit of a stir, and if it's not all mixed, that's okay. It'll actually look better on your paper. And you can just mix it right on the paper. You don't have to put it in your palette. And just see how things mix out. Just keep adding it till it suits you. So there's something about over mixing, and it doesn't happen with all colors, but sometimes it really makes a difference. Okay, I think I am going to leave a lot of this till next week. I'm going to go through the end down here so we can look at all of these things I had for us to look at, talk about. We need to talk about them another time. Oh, there I was. What I left for you on your handout today to do is do a triad painting. And I've got listed here 4 triads that came out of a book, and then one that I did myself. As you can see, it's just endless which 3 paints you might want to choose. There's so much variety in paints. This one's called a full spectrum. That's what she called it. You can give them any name you want. But you can compare them this way. Here they are, the 4 that she has given you here. And you can see how the choice of your colors really affects the color of your painting, the overall tone of it. You have a really warm one up there in the upper right corner, a really cool one down at the bottom, that water triad. So it really affects the feeling and mood of your painting to do this, and adds a lot of unity to it. Unity is one of the main reasons you're going to want to limit the number of colors in any painting that you ever do. It's very rarely that you want to use a whole lot of colors in a painting. Some will call for it, but most often not. Just a handful are usually plenty. Five or six, about all I ever use in one painting. So here you can see I've laid out what they've used to get these colors. And here's one I painted, and the triad I used ultramarine blue, Indian red, and quinacridone gold. Now, one thing I want to bring out here is see this whole area down here and over here. I painted that differently. I put in a gate and I put in a road, and it was too cluttered. And it was distracting, and it was a bad composition, and I didn't like it for a number of reasons. So, white gouache mixed with a little quinacridone gold, I just painted right over that, and it turned into a field, and made a lot better painting. One thing with a large amount of white gouache is you start losing transparency. It works much better in small areas, but I did a large area there. And I thought the picture worked out a lot better for it. The sky color up here is Naples yellow, and I'll just talk about Naples yellow next week because it's a good color. I think used in a lot of ways. I use it for flesh and I use it for skies. The dark clouds are ultramarine and Indian red. Some Indian red here. That little spot right there might be the only pure Indian red I used in this painting. But I mixed it on the roof with a little quinacridone gold to get that warm brownish color. And so 3 colors, you can get just about anything you want. And I think I've got you some handout things there. And we better end it, and we'll next week. Plus, I've got a lot of other stuff to talk about next week. I tell you, it's hard to get everything in 4 classes. But we'll do what we can do. And if there's any questions, and if we have time, Gina, I'll take questions. And if not.
Yes, we have some time for questions.
Okay. I left a lot unsaid. I know that.
So if you could pick, you know, what is the minimum number of colors you really need to have to do paintings if you're starting out?
Well, the minimum would be 3, I suppose, but I would pick, I'd probably pick right here. I think I said in your handout, I probably wrote that in, but I'd pick around 12 to 14, probably.
Okay.
14 more than likely. And that's throwing in maybe a couple of extra greens and earth tones that you wouldn't get in a normal kit, just because they're useful. And certain colors that I think are worth getting that are useful. That's one reason I like a palette that will have room for at least 18 colors. That's what this one has right here. And you can see what I've done. I buy empty half pans and just squirt paint in them from tube paint. And so I don't even know how many I've got in here. I don't use all of these. Some of these are just trials. But if you look at the back of this one right here, see that little blue stuff there? That's wall putty or blue tack, and a little pinch of that, and I can just stick it right on my palette. So works really well. And I stick them in my metal palettes. I can just fill up a metal palette that's supposed to hold 12 paints. So I can put 24, I think, in the same thing by doing that. And they don't fall out or anything. So that works well for me. But yeah, you know.
Kenneth?
Yes.
What about ultramarine violet or quin violet?
Marine violet, I don't know really.
Oh, no, I said ultramarine.
Oh, ultramarine? What about it now?
I wondered, what about those two? Quin violet and ultramarine violet end up being the 2 I've got.
They're fine. Ultramarine violet is probably a little bit bluer, more than likely. The quinacridone violet is probably pretty transparent. Those quinacridone colors are really good colors.
Okay, thank you.
You know, when it gets down to particular shades, it really comes down to what you want and not what I want. Because, you know, heck, I may have enough cataract that everything looks a little yellow. You can't ever tell. So color choice can really depend on the way you see things in a lot of ways too. You're painting.
Now, something I understood from what you were describing earlier is that you wanted a yellow tint to a color and or a cool tint and a warm tint. So you could almost start off with just 6 colors and then a gouache or something.
You sure could. You sure could. Everything else is just convenience. Although some colors you just can't really match too well. Cobalt teal, say for example, is a mixture of green and blue and white. So, you know, it's just a pain to try and mix something like that. It's better just to buy some that you like. as long as you've got room. If you have too many colors, you can't ever find what you want either. What's best is start out with a few, get used to them and how they work, and then add some more. Once you know what more you might want to add, or you can end up buying a whole lot of paint that you really will never use. Let me zip back here real quick to somewhere. I thought I put that in there. Anyway, I probably put it in the handout. You can buy these things right here. Here they are.
If you'll stop sharing your screen, then we can see that easier.
Okay. See, this is color dots. Like from Daniel Smith, you can buy pages of these with every paint they make. And save you a lot of money. You can try them out. These are actual paints, and you can lift them right off of the paper and paint with them and see what you think. Here's one from Whole Bean. They're just very useful if you can, you know.
From who?
What?
What was that last one? You said it was from
Whole Bean Artists Watercolors.
Okay.
I think I got that one at maybe Art Outfitters for free. The Daniel Smith one you have to buy. I think for the entire set's $20 or something, but it's very much worth it. You know, one tube of paint costs about $12, $13 sometimes. So you can save a lot of money with those and really learn a lot about painting. So, like that. Well, any other questions?
I think they all would love it if you talk to them for 3 hours, but I'm sorry, we don't have time.
I tell you, get into paint, you could.
Yeah, especially if you're working along as you do this, it flies by, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So thank you all. I hope that it was easier for you to get to class today. I'm sorry we had so much trouble the first couple of weeks with the Zoom number and that sort of thing. We look forward to him teaching again in the fall with us. He's got one more week this month. And, you know, we have all sorts of free and open classes right now. I encourage you to attend any of them. So we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Ken. Thank you, Gina.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.